Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. I'm your host, Hope Bohanec, and you can find all our awesome archived shows by going to our website, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org. And you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. Okay, the wait is over. My new book, The Humane Hoax, is finally out. I am thrilled to share this powerful work with the world. It's an anthology that I edited with 18 contributing authors, 18 chapters, a very timely topic. And today we're going to have two guests on the show to discuss the book, Alistair Van Cleek, who wrote one of the chapters, and Sina Crutchley, who is a member of our Humane Hoax team. So, beyond the book, The Humane Hoax is an entire project of compassionate living. It's a collaborative project with other activists, sanctuaries, nonprofits. We just updated our website, humanehoax.org. So, you should check that out. It's got some great new information and information about the book. And we have a volunteer team that meets monthly, and Alistair and Sina are on that team. So we will be discussing and highlighting a few of the chapters from the book. So, just to give some background and history of this project, I've been researching this issue now that I call the humane hoax. Others have called it the humane myth or humane washing for about 20 years now. And I've been doing larger animal advocacy work and environmental work for over 30 years. And in the 90s and early 2000s, as activists and vegans were becoming more vocal about the horrors of the animal agriculture industry, what animals endure in animal farming, we started getting media coverage, and people were starting to become more aware that something wasn't right about this industry. And what started happening maybe about 15 years ago or so is that the clever marketers of this industry started responding to the critiques, right? With labels and marketing that was meant to appease and reassure consumers that things were improving, that things weren't as bad as we were saying, as activists were saying. And we started seeing labels like cage free and grass fed and certified humane, and I recognized that this was only going to continue and potentially be a real problem for our movement, for our goal of ending farmed animal suffering, that these labels could possibly lull people into believing that there was a kind way to commodify animals, that there was widespread improvement going on in the industry when really there was not. And pretty soon after that, after the first book came out, I kept thinking that I needed to write another one because there was just so much more information coming out on the subject, so much more to say. And there was also starting to be more interest in the subject from other activists and other writers and academics. And I thought it would be really powerful, rather than me just writing another book on the subject, that other voices would be heard, that other perspectives beyond my own could be heard. So I got the idea to compile an anthology on the subject of humane washing and greenwashing. And I actually started reaching out to potential authors, I think in like 2018 or something. It's been a really long time. The pandemic put a hold on publishing, so we had to kind of get through that. And now finally it's out. I'm so relieved and excited, and it's just been this huge ongoing project. So it's really fantastic to finally see it come to fruition. So I feel that this issue is such an important issue to focus on. I feel that it's really kind of our 21st century challenge, right? That people have a seemingly humane alternative to vegan. It didn't used to be that way. In the 90s, even in the early 2000s, if you did not want to support cruelty in animal farming, the only option was vegan. But now it seems that you can avoid cruelty and still eat meat, dairy, and eggs. And of course, that can never be the case. So, this is our new challenge. to counter these labels, these false narratives from the industry that is trying to maintain their product line, maintain their market share, trying desperately to hold on to this cruel, unsustainable, outdated industry with soothing stories of improved conditions. But as my book reveals, confining and commodifying animals' bodies can never be humane. So I have some requests of you to help get the word out about this really powerful book. I so appreciate you, the podcast listeners, and I hope that you will step up and be ambassadors for this book. So, first off, please buy a copy. Maybe buy two, buy another one for a friend, or donate one to a library. All the proceeds will be going to compassionate living. I'm not making any profit on this book. So please buy a book. Then please write a review on Amazon. No matter where you purchase the book, you don't have to buy the book from Amazon. You can buy the book directly from the publisher, Lantern. But please write a review on Amazon. That really helps to bump the book up on the Amazon algorithm. So go to Amazon and write a review of the book. It can be short, just, hey, loved this book, a must read, or whatever. Or if you want to get into more detail, that's awesome too. But that is such a huge, huge help if you can go to Amazon and write a review of the book. Then, and this is the fun one, join us for the virtual book launch party on Saturday, April 29th. This event is going to be part of the Climate Healers Conference called VCOP13. The conference is the whole weekend. It's multiple panels on Saturday and Sunday, April 29th and 30th. But our event, the book launch, will be on Saturday, April 29th, 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. And we will be hearing from like 7 of the authors. I'm so excited that they're willing to join me for this. So many of the authors are going to be there. Karen Davis, John Sanbanmatsu, Robert Grillo, Silas Rao, and more are going to be there. We're going to be giving away copies of the book with some trivia questions. It's going to be fun. So I really hope you can come. I would so appreciate the support and would love to have my podcast folks there. So please join us. I'll have a link to the registration in the show notes. Okay, so we're now going to jump into our conversation with Alistair and Sina about the new book, The Humane Hoax. Hope you enjoy it. All right, so we have 2 guests joining us today. Alistair Van Cleek has a PhD in English and lives with their partner Roz near Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Alistair and Roz founded the Triangle Chicken Advocates Sanctuary in 2014, which inspired them to start the Micro Sanctuary movement as well. Alistair co-founded the Humane Hoax Project with me and contributed a chapter to the anthology that we're going to be discussing, The Humane Hoax. And much of Alistair's other writings can be found at strivingwithsystems.com. Welcome back to the podcast, Alistair.
Hey, Ho.
Hey, good to have you. And we also have Sina Crutchley. Sina is an associate professor and longtime animal rights and environmental activist. She founded and is a board member of Piedmont Area Vegan Educators. Sina also founded and runs Ruby's Refuge, a micro sanctuary for chickens and fishes. And she volunteers with the Humane Hoax Project team. Welcome to the podcast, Sina.
Thank you, Hope.
So I'm really excited to have both of you here today. We're going to be talking about the book that I have edited that is finally out called The Humane Hoax, Essays Exposing the Myth of Happy Meat, Humane Dairy, and Ethical Eggs. And we're going to do this kind of book club style. So Alistair, of course, wrote a chapter in the anthology, and Sina's on our Humane Hoax Project team. So we're going to talk about just a few of the chapters that inspired us. And spoiler alert, we will be talking about some of the chapters in depth, not revealing everything, but But about 4 or 5 of the chapters we're going to be talking about. There's 18 chapters in the book, and I think that you will still enjoy reading any of the chapters that we talk about, but just, a little bit of a spoiler that we will be doing some deep dives into these chapters. And we're going to start a little differently today. Alistair has been on the podcast before, and I believe this is their third time on, right? Is this your third?
Yeah, I think it's the third.
Yeah. So we've gotten your story, and Sina's new, but we're gonna start a little differently. We usually ask kind of a get to know you question, but I'm gonna ask both of you why you think that the humane hoax is an important aspect of farmed animal advocacy to focus on, kind of starting more broadly. And just briefly, I've defined the humane hoax on this podcast before. Listeners should be familiar, but just a brief review. When we're talking about the humane hoax, of course, we're talking about humane washing and greenwashing of animal farming and animal products. We're talking about labels and marketing like local and family farms and cage free and free range and all of that. And of course, greenwashing, the environmental kind of aspect of it with labels like sustainable and regenerative. But also included in the humane hoax is backyard farming for eggs and meat. So we'll get into all of this. But I want to start broadly before we get into the book. And I'd like to ask you both, but let's start with Alistair. Why do you think that the humane hoax is an important aspect of farmed animal advocacy to focus on?
Yeah, for personal reasons, just based on our rescue experience and running our sanctuary, the humane hoax is really kind of the realm in which we dwell in terms of, encountering victims of animal farming and seeing, the harm that animal farming does to individual animal bodies. So for us, it's very personal, but, also we really see that there isn't this, hard and fast line between large scale industrial type farming and the type of farming that goes on in backyards. And so if you are interested in talking about sort of like what farming looks like and the ethics of farming, those, are sometimes two different things. And so we're less interested in talking about welfare and in farming and more interested in talking about the ethics of using animals and exploitation. And for us, the humane hoax is a key part of that ethical discussion because it really gets to the heart of how wrong it is to use animals in any form for our own benefit.
Yeah. Sina, same question for you. What do you think?
Yeah, so I stopped eating animals in 1984 and then went vegan in 2011. And I can clearly remember believing the lies and deceptions of the humane hoax before I went vegan. I remember approaching some of my activism from a more welfarist perspective, just not really understanding the implications of all of that. So over the years since becoming vegan, I've been really disturbed by seeing longer lines at grocery stores that present themselves as being more humane, more environmentally conscious, and people lining up and paying a lot of money for body parts and secretions that are labeled humane and sustainable, and realizing that those labels make people feel like they're doing something good when we know that there is no good way to commodify someone. And then when I do my outreach now, like that's one of the most frequent arguments that I hear people talking about, well, the meat that I get is from animals raised humanely, and giving all of those arguments again in a way to make themselves feel like they're not participating in something violent and destructive like all animal agribusiness is.
Yeah.
I realize that if we can demonstrate to people that abuse occurs at every level in animal agribusiness, that we're going to expose that foundation, and we really need to strike at the foundation of commodification of sentient beings. And I think really that's where the humane hoax sits.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that now when you're doing outreach, you're hearing these excuses, right? Or these statements about, oh, well, my eggs are cage free or whatever it is. That's a new phenomenon. I mean,
Right.
when we used to do outreach back in the day of the 90s, early 2000s, there was no other option but vegan. If you wanted to, not exploit animals, if you wanted to be free of the cruelty of animal agriculture, there was only one choice. But now there's this seeming choice, right? This seemingly
Hmm.
better way. Yeah, and that's what the Humane Hoax is. That's why, I focused on this book, and we focus on this project. Okay, so well, let's get into the book. We wanted to talk about the first two chapters, one of which is Alistair's, the second chapter, and the first chapter is titled A Pig Called Silver by Ingrid Taylor. And Ingrid will be speaking in depth about her chapter at our upcoming Humane Hoax online conference on May 20th. And then the second chapter is Alistair's, and that one is called The Terrible Truths of Backyard Chicken Farming. And I just want to talk about the reasons that I chose these two chapters to feature at the very beginning of the book. It's because they both had direct stories of animals that were victims of the humane hoax system. And the story that Ingrid tells is of being raised on a small pig farm. Her father was a pig farmer. They would only have about 40 pigs at a time. So it certainly was a small operation, a family farm. And right away in her chapter, we hear just the heartbreaking reality of all pig farming, that the runts of the litter, the smaller piglets, the sick piglets, that these piglets are not considered profitable to be raised for meat. So they are often killed in brutal ways as soon as they're born. And there was this little piglet that they named Silver that was one of the runts. And Ingrid's mother took pity on her, brought her into the family home. I'm not going to go into any more detail about it, but it's a tearjerker. And rereading it the other day, I actually teared up again, just as I did the first time that I read that chapter. And then the second chapter, Alistair's chapter, tells about the story of BB the chicken. And I'll let Alistair elaborate on that one. But, I knew it was a risk to put both these kind of very sad stories up front in the book. I could have started with more stats and information on labels and stuff like that. One of the chapters was a little lighter, but maybe to ease people in. But this book is not about labels. It's not about marketing. It's about animals, real animals that suffer because of the labels. And I wanted to establish that right away. I wanted stories that would draw the reader in, make you care. I wanted people to understand why we should care. And I really hope that these two really powerful chapters do that. So, Alistair, please talk about your chapter. Tell us about your chapter. What inspired you to write what you wrote?
I mean, I think what inspired us to write, I mean, obviously BB's story is a kind of really concrete example of the things that we see, every time that we do a new rescue at our sanctuary. And we've been, our sanctuary was started in February of 2014 after we rescued two hens from an animal shelter in our area. And, for us immediately after meeting them, like everything that we were about as vegans, and our whole idea of animal advocacy started to change because we were seeing the realities of animal farming through the experiences of these two hens. And so, for us, like it's really all about looking at animal farming through that sort of individual experience. And that's why I think putting those two chapters is so important, not just out of self-interest because one of them is mine, but because so often the discussions that we have as advocates and activists are about kind of big picture issues or about general topics. I mean, even if you're talking about labels and animal farming practices and things like that, like it's all kind of systemic issues that happen in the animal farming industry. Whereas in reality, the reason that we're doing this is because of the individual suffering of every single of the billions and billions of animals who go through the animal farming system every year.
Yeah.
And that reality is true for each and every one of them, no matter what type of farm that they're on. It's just that the situation is changed slightly from one type of farm to another. The only thing that we really find useful for us to do now as sanctuary caregivers and as advocates is to help tell the stories of those individuals we've rescued and that we've had the pleasure to share our lives with since we started our sanctuary. Because I really feel like you can talk about all of the big picture issues and all of the problems with animal farming through the experiences of these living, breathing individuals. And to me, that makes it so much more of a way to make a connection with people, because everyone has had an experience of loving a dog or loving a cat or having a pet growing up, and they can understand that one-to-one connection through the experiences of a beloved animal. And for us, there is no difference between having a family member who's a dog and having a family member who's a chicken. I think Ingrid's chapter is really good about that, because you see how her family connects with this one pig, Silver, and that allows her to kind of really think about what's going on in the big picture with their pig farm. And then all of the labels and all of the happy washing, humane washing that happens around that kind of falls away, because you realize what these individuals are going through. And so it starts to not make as much sense, because you're like, well, this is all just kind of euphemisms for things that are happening that are actually really quite harmful and cause quite a lot of suffering. And so I think it's really, one, honoring the individuality of these animals who suffer by telling their stories and grounding our advocacy in their stories. But two, also really kind of, it's just true. I mean, it's what happens. And a lot of times just talking about issues and ideas can sometimes not really get to the reality of that in a way that like those lived experiences do from the rescued animals and sanctuary residents.
Yeah. Yeah. Sina, I know you also have a micro sanctuary with chickens and other animals. What did you think about Alistair's chapter, and how has the experience that you've had witnessing, rescuing through your sanctuary, how's that influenced what you think about the humane hoax?
Thanks, Hope. And I feel like I should say that part of the reason why I have a micro sanctuary right now is because of Alistair. So thank you, Alistair, for helping me to get started in rescuing chickens. So with their chapter, I connected with so much of that chapter, as they said, talking about getting to know chickens as individuals, about how roosters are often forgotten and invisible, about how backyard chickens don't often get the protection from the elements and predators like they deserve, how they are often denied basic health care, and just how the whole egg industry is unethical. Is it okay if I elaborate on some of that, Hope?
Yeah, please do.
Since we started our micro sanctuary, we've had 6 hens in our care. We currently have 3. The first 4 chickens who we rescued came from a large rescue from a farm that had been labeled free range, humane. It had an ASPCA certified humane label. People would read the terms that they used for marketing and think that this was a wonderful farm where everyone was raised in lovely conditions, killed humanely, although they probably didn't think about the killing part. So, anyway, one of the girls from that original 4 who we rescued, Gladys, died just a few months later. And because we rescued them from that farm, and chickens are often slaughtered by like 7 weeks of age, so they were around 7 weeks old when we adopted these 4. So Gladys died just a few months later of Marek's disease. And if for anyone who is unfamiliar with Marek's disease, it's a common viral disease that we see in chickens. Anyway, another one of the first 4, Ruby, who's probably my soul chicken, died of
And who's the namesake of your
yes,
sanctuary?
Ruby's
Uh-huh.
refuge. That's right.
Yeah.
So she died a month before she would have turned 2 years old of cancer. And then the other 2 of those first 4, Rose and Gertie, we still have, and they are doing great, and they will turn 4 years old in November. But I'm thinking about Ruby, so you're right, the namesake of the refuge.
Mhm.
She clearly loved being alive. She loved to sit on my lap. She loved to be petted. When I shook her treat ball, she would come running for it and enjoy every snack. So you could see her joy every day.
Mm.
And then the thought that someone would have been okay with eating her body at 7 weeks old is just really terrifying.
Yeah.
When I think about in Alistair's chapter talking about vet care, that also makes me think of Ruby. And then Sophia, who we later adopted, Ruby had bumblefoot, and that's a staph infection that can occur in the feet of some chickens and turkeys. We spent well over $1,500, and we would spend more if we needed to help get that treated by an avian veterinarian. And people were always shocked when we spent that much money on someone who they would, just go to a grocery store and pay $5 for their body. This quote from Alistair's chapter, I think, connects to that. How humane can something be when individual lives are measured in dollars and cents, and when a culture of ignorance and neglect is accepted as the standard?
Mm. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really
Um,
powerful.
yeah.
Yeah, there's so many hidden cruelties. It's just mind-boggling. And
Mhm.
rereading Alistair's chapter recently, I had forgotten the story of the 800 chicks that died in a shipping box at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, when all the mail was having
Yes.
disruptions, and the mail kind of stopped, and there were like 800 chicks that died because they were just sitting there. They just completely died of, dehydration, starvation. And it's just
Yes.
horrible, horrible. And chicks die every day in the US mail,
Mhm.
being shipped to, cage free and free range facilities and feed stores for people to buy for the backyard hens and eggs. I mean, it's just yet another hidden cruelty that doesn't change with a humane label.
Yes, and thinking about the roosters and how they mentioned how the baby chicks that are identified as males are sometimes used as packing material for shipping chicks, and that's just
Yeah,
terrifying.
awful. Really, really horrible. I actually have a quote from Alistair's chapter that I would love to read as well. And here it is. Indeed, backyard chickens, and that's in quotes, is its own sort of euphemism, relying on the omission of roosters in order to maintain the bubolic image of happy hens and happy eggs. But this is a hoax. It is the humane hoax in practice. It's a lie that makes backyard farmers feel better about the same exploitation of non consenting bodies, of manipulated reproductive systems, and their human benefit. It's the sort of lie that makes macerating and suffocating chicks at a hatchery, or dumping 9 roosters in a strange place at night, or sending BB's 8 baby brothers back to the farmer, all horrid forms of collateral damage that are necessary to maintaining the happy hen and happy egg image. I thought that was really, really well said, and really highlights the hidden cruelties, that are behind this facade of benign farming, humane farming, right?
I agree. It's so well written and startling.
Yeah. And Alistair, did you have anything to add about that quote or anything we're talking about?
Yeah, I appreciate the positive feedback. I mean, it's hard because I mean, I feel like because we're a sanctuary focused on roosters, I really see the ways in which, roosters specifically are just completely hidden and forgotten by everyone, whether it's the general public, whether it's farmers, or whether it's even other vegans. Roosters are not the most popular animals to be, kind of advocated for and to have interest in them and stuff. It's frustrating because I really, really adore them. And I'm so fascinated by their behaviors and their personalities and the way that they interact with each other. And so it's a shame that they're seen as such a waste product and a byproduct of animal farming. I think it really highlights just how much harm and suffering goes into making these supposedly humane products available for people. Like whenever anyone talks about eggs, like the first thing that I think about is the roosters.
Mm.
Because I know the realities of the situation with the roosters and how every practice involves, kind of the deaths of billions upon billions of roosters. So for us, it's a really poignant reality that we deal with, and I'm frustrated that on the one hand that it's so easy for people to get a pass on having to deal with the repercussions of their farming practices when it comes to roosters, but also too, just how slow the interest in like understanding roosters better has been, in the general population and also amongst like my fellow vegans.
Yeah, I love that, the section on roosters in your chapter is titled, Where Are Their Brothers? And I love that, how we have to ask that every time we're talking about chickens, eggs, the hens, where are their brothers? Because for every one chicken, there's a rooster, a brother out there that was born and that suffered and died somehow along the way. And you do a fabulous job of showing all the different things that a rooster faces just being born male in that industry.
Yeah, and I think I mean I can understand that not everyone is going to immediately have a connection with a rooster or with chickens in general. But I think that for me, they're a really good, kind of case study in the realities of animal farming. And so for us, like in addition to the connection that we have with roosters, like we hope that advocating for roosters is a way to kind of advocate for everyone because, it's so clear and it's so stark and it's so kind of just like emotionally damaging to like learn about all the realities that roosters go through. And it's just it's a good example of what happens at every instance and every scale in animal farming, is that there are individuals who are harmed, considered byproducts, considered means to ends, and the end is either having something on the plate or making money. Yeah, I'm definitely like fascinated with rooster behavior and just roosters as individuals, but I also think that they provide a lot of really good insights into the realities of animal farming when you kind of learn about all the stuff that they go through.
Yeah, and all the stereotyping that happens with all the, chickens being stupid, roosters being mean, all those terrible things that you and Sina know to be untrue because you live with them. You are with these animals every day. So the reality that they are complex, emotional beings with individual personalities, and that really comes through in the stories that are told in the story of BB in your chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to read another quote from their chapter if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So, the problem with eggs is also the concern for roosters. The fate of roosters is intimately and irrevocably intertwined with the experience of hens and backyard flocks and in egg consumption generally. So I think that sums it up pretty well. And it reminds me too. So we live in the city and we are in a city that has an ordinance that doesn't allow roosters. So I'm more inspired after reading that chapter to speak to our city officials. But even though like we're not allowed to have roosters in our city and I'm such a small micro sanctuary, I still get calls from people who have roosters. They have the accidental rooster and they're in the city and can I help them find a home for them? So, even as small as we are, I understand that like Triangle Chicken Advocates and other larger sanctuaries and micro sanctuaries get calls almost daily, so I'm surprised that even we get regular calls about roosters, and so I think that it just kinda highlights the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, it was a fantastic chapter, Alistair, and we apparently had a lot to say about it, which is great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But we probably should move on to some of the other chapters. So we also wanted to talk about Ingrid's chapter, the first chapter of the book, and that one was titled A Pig Called Silver. We've kind of mentioned it a bit. And I love that she got into so much of the stuff that I talk about in my presentations on the Humane Hoax about pastured animals and this kind of romanticized notion that if we just get the animals out of the confinement buildings and onto pasture, that all the welfare issues will be eradicated if we can just get animals out of the confinement barns. And what that really fails to take into account is that these are domesticated animals. They are not wild animals. They can't just be thrown outdoors and, everything's okay. So there's this study that really underscores the myriad of problems with free ranging animals and putting farmed animals out to pasture and the range of issues that they face and sometimes that they suffer even more when they're out on pasture. And it's this meta-analysis that looked at numerous studies and articles, but for like 20 years, between 2000 to 2020, looked at organic and free range pork operations. And I actually, I felt that this was such an important study. I really wanted it in the book. I put the word out for someone to write a chapter around this study and to incorporate this study because I just felt it was so important. And that's how I found Ingrid through Sentient Media. She writes for Sentient Media, and they had put my request out to their writers. And she had this incredible lived experience growing up on a small scale pig farm. So I was so grateful that she could write this chapter. I really loved the chapter. And Sina, what would you want to start? What did you think of Ingrid's chapter?
Well, I want to thank you for starting off today by talking about how the chapter was a tearjerker because just while you were saying it, like my eyes were welling up with tears. So, boy, that's the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think right now, even like you can probably hear in my voice, I'm getting choked up.
Oh, yeah.
Ah, wow. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think some of it is just that you get to almost feel like you're experiencing her experience growing up and meeting this piglet Silver, and then coming full circle through her life, now vegan and as a veterinarian, able to look back at that whole experience and look back at how her perceptions as a child were influenced by grown-ups around her and the way they perceived non-human animals and their speciesism. So I think that that's one of the beauties of the chapter. But just hearing the story about Silver, so Silver was this one, like I think you said earlier, runt of the piglets who, for some reason, her mom felt compelled to keep and bring into the home. And a quote from that chapter, maybe my mother had seen so much death that she wanted to be able to save just one individual from a painful demise. Like we see her trying to understand why the adults in her life when she was a child, why they were able to do what they did, and how they were able to do what they did. Yeah, so then she also talked then about problems with pigs raised on pasture. And so I learned a lot from that chapter. I didn't know a lot of this, that in many ways, life is worse, health is worse, the environment is worse with pigs raised on pasture.
Yeah, it's people don't realize, it drives me crazy that everybody has this romanticized notion of putting animals out to pasture, but what happens with these domesticated animals is that they get exposed to extreme temperatures, heat stress, sometimes they're not able to get adequate shade, and the lighter colored skin. So of course, everyone likes light meat or whatever. What is it called? White meat.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to do with the color of the feathers or the skin of the animal. And so they prefer white meat, which is going to be pink pigs, the lighter skinned pigs, but that lighter skin can make them more susceptible to sunburn, blistering, in the sun, right? In the extreme cold, there's frostbite. Little piglets can get hypothermia and pneumonia. They're more vulnerable to predators being out, in pasture. They have more contact with wildlife, so they get more pathogens and parasites. I mean, it goes on and on. All the problems and issues that can arise from them being exposed outside into the elements.
And we know the average person is not going to know any of that. Like you said, they're just going to hear what they're presented with.
Yeah.
And they're presented with this, bucolic image of pigs living out on pasture, and everything just looks like they have lovely lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in on that,
Yeah.
one thing that I thought about Ingrid's chapter that was really interesting to me was the way in which, her family's connection with the pig and then the pig going outside and then kind of the inevitable, consequences of being a pig on a farm. The way that her mother, tries to kind of like, Well, I just like to think that maybe something, positive happened along the way. It's this sort of like willful, ignorance to the realities of what happens. And this is by someone who owns the farm.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it's just staggering to me
Yeah.
that this sort of like, kind of mental gymnastics happen for people to keep doing things that they at some degree know are harmful.
Right,
Um,
right. Just to
and
clarify, Ingrid asked what happened to Silver, and her mom said something like, "Well, I like to think that, she's just lived out there and it was all fine, even though they both knew that that's probably not what happened."
right. I mean, I think it's a good example of the humane hoax in practice is that like, it's this kind of shared delusion about the reality of animal farming.
Yeah.
And for some people it's based on ignorance, for other people it's based on creating a narrative about what's going on so that it becomes morally acceptable to kill these animals. But if you look at what happens is like in the case of Silver the pig, like they have this emotional connection. This pig becomes an individual with a personality who's a member of the family, and then because it's a farm, the end is going to be a tragedy. For someone to be able to like make that connection, and then in the case of the parents then also slaughter the pig, or have the pig slaughtered, it's kind of like both sides of the humane hoax in practice, because I see a lot of farmers talking about how that all their animals are spoiled and they're treated just like members of the family, and all these sorts of really warm and fuzzy things. But then you realize in 6 months or 8 months or a year, those animals are all going to be slaughtered.
Yeah.
And so I think Ingrid's mother's experience is possibly a good example of just how delusional the whole thing is, because we know what the realities are. No matter how well the Silver was treated or how supposedly well any of these animals on a farm are treated, the reality is the animal is turned into food, and that should be horrifying. I
Yeah.
mean, it's hard for us three to sit here and just talk about the chapter describing this. I mean, that should give you an indication of the realities of the humane hoax. It is a hoax. It's a delusion. It's a falsehood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that chapter when they talked about how they allowed some, I guess, neighbors to come and slaughter their pigs on their property and what they witnessed and experienced. I've got so many quotes that I've highlighted, but maybe this highlights what Alistair was just saying. No matter how they may be presented to the public, pastured pigs are bred and raised for human consumption. Whether they are slaughtered on the farm or at a slaughterhouse, they are all eventually killed for this purpose in ways that are traumatic, frightening, and inhumane. That's the truth.
So let's wrap up Ingrid's chapter and move on to another focus. But does anyone have any final thoughts on Ingrid's chapter?
I think it's just such a good example of the humane hoax because we really get to see, like Alistair said earlier, both sides of it. That's definitely an important chapter for anyone to read who reads the book.
Yeah, I personally, I really liked Ingrid's chapter just because she's able to kind of make the story very personalized and talk about the realities of making connections with individual animals on farms, while also kind of explaining the realities that go into animal farming, not just the impact on the animals, but also larger issues like the environment and labeling and things like that. And so I really like the way that Ingrid's chapter is able to blend kind of that individual connection with kind of these more large scale kind of systemic problems, so that people can, I think, be able to talk about pastured pigs in a way that's very informed by the realities of that the individual animals go through, as well as kind of things that people are going to, potentially use as rebuttals or use as point to as examples for why pastured pigs are actually really humane and good.
Yeah.
Can I add too that,
Yeah.
oftentimes an argument that I hear in outreach is people saying, well, I'm sure you've never been on a farm, or I'm sure you've never, actually seen what happens on a farm. And so she is an excellent example of she can speak to the realities of a farm and she can speak
Yeah.
to the realities of the humane hoax and
Yeah.
pigs raised on pasture.
Yeah, absolutely. That there are those voices out there, those people that are now vegan, that were raised on a farm, did know farming, were intimately connected to farming and saw the realities for what they are. So yeah, that's a good point. So let's move on to another chapter. And we all wanted to talk about Christopher Soul Eubank's chapter. And Soul is the founder of Apex Advocacy in Atlanta, Georgia, and they advocate for collective liberation. And his chapter was called How Colonization Helped to Normalize the Humane Hoax. And Alistair really wanted to talk about this one. I'm going to let Alistair just introduce this whole chapter and get us started with this one.
Sure. Yes. So I really think that Soul's chapter was a very important one to include in this anthology. I'm glad he was able to contribute. Just because I think that so often when we talk about the humane hoax and we talk about animal farming and animal exploitation, it can be easy to forget the fact that like all of the practices that we're so horrified about being done to non-human animals have historically been done to other human beings as well. And we see it going on today in various different forms. But historically, we point to things, various systems of exploitation. And in Soul's case, he talks a lot about colonialism and the way that colonialism is tied in directly with capitalism and the way that it turns individual beings and individual bodies into commodities that'll be used for exploitation. And if I can just read a quote real quick from his chapter that I really resonated with and thought was important.
Yeah.
He writes, capitalism, which is a product of colonialism, has also fueled the humane hoax by using profit as a way to exacerbate the oppression of non-human animals. Non-human animals were exploited long before capitalism, but capitalism, under the umbrella of colonialism, has made it easily digestible to consume the lies of animal agriculture. This emotional warfare on the spirit of our collective consciousness helps our society to ignore the layers of nuance that exist when we attempt to extend our compassion beyond humanity. It also permeates how people from the dominant group often address human rights issues. So I think that really gets to the heart of the problem with the humane hoax, on a broader spectrum, and the way that it really relies upon this capitalist mindset of commodifying individuals and continuing to exploit them. But we just rely on this kind of as I was saying before, this shared delusion about the happiness of the beings who are being exploited as a justification for doing what we're doing and benefiting from their exploitation. I really appreciated the fact that he was able to talk about the way that colonialism is tied into our animal farming system, because it introduced all these domesticated species into what had once been indigenous landscapes and into native ecosystems, and we see the damage that it's wrought these centuries later. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind the impact of colonialism and capitalism and human exploitation that has been part of animal exploitation for centuries.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Sina, what did you think about this chapter?
I was so glad that Alistair suggested reading that chapter as one of the first ones. I didn't go in order through the book, by the way. But but
That's the beautiful thing about an anthology, right? Is you don't have to read it
right,
cover to cover. You can just pick what chapters are interesting to you. Yeah, I love that.
right, yeah. So I don't want to just go like quote after quote, but I have three quotes. Maybe I'll just share a couple that I think really stood out to me from that chapter. And that's another chapter that I think anybody reading the book needs to read. So, our compassion should be consistent for all oppressed beings because experiencing mass exploitation, violence, and oppression. But the more we allow humane hoaxes to persist, the more oxygen they will create for other oppressions to breathe.
Mm,
Ah,
well
yeah,
said. Yeah.
yeah. And then the other shorter quote, others in quotes are just a different version of ourselves existing in different bodies who want to live and to live free of suffering.
I so appreciate that Soul wrote this chapter, and I really appreciate the broader movement in the animal advocacy space to really get out of the silo of animal rights being separate from everything. I mean,
Hmm.
that's kind of how we've operated for a long time, that animal rights is just this kind of separate select issue that doesn't have to do with everything else going on in the world and social justice and human rights, and it does. I mean, it's all connected. It's all systematic violence, and there's no way that we could get everybody to go vegan, but then there would be all these other oppressions as well. I mean, I don't think that's the world we want to see. not only is it just the right thing to do to address these other issues, but it's also connected, that when you are affecting one, it's affecting the other, and it's all connected and so important.
Well, I mean, and I think it's so a couple things. So first, like I think it's unrealistic to pretend that we all aren't kind of existing in these multiple, multiply, intersecting spaces. Because we're human beings and we're advocating for animals, but while being human beings, we may be experiencing things, as a woman or as a trans person or like as a neurodivergent person or
Yeah.
as a person of the global majority in a white patriarchal capitalist system. All these things are things that are realities in our lives, and we're seeing the way that systems of oppression happen in our own lives. And to pretend like that's not relevant for us as activists and as advocates is, I think, is something that we've tried to pretend is possible for far too long.
Yeah.
So I think, on one hand, it's important for us to honor the lives and individualities and experiences of the people who are advocates, and to say that these things that they're experiencing are real, and that the oppression or prejudice that they're experiencing is something that's wrong. But I also see that, like, I think one of the pitfalls of like taking sort of an animals only or animals first approach to doing activism is that a lot of times it can become an opportunity to excuse really bad, toxic, and harmful behavior by activists.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's a long history of men doing very bad things in activist circles, and a lot of times they get forgiven for it because they're doing vegan activism. I think that's horrible and that's toxic and that needs to stop.
Yeah.
But also too, like I think it really allows for the people who benefit from these systems of exploitation to drive wedges between groups of people, and to make like the vegans be doing this thing over here, and the people who are advocating for LGBTQ rights are over there, and there's no conversation between them, and it becomes like like a battle or like conflict, rather than being as something where people can come together and fight the real mechanisms that are keeping these systems of exploitation happening.
Yeah.
So not taking an intersectional approach, or not taking an approach that allows talking about collective liberation and these intersecting issues, I feel like a lot of times it's a way to keep us divided. And I think that actually Soul talks about that in his chapter when he gives the example of the television show Woke,
Right.
where the main character has a traumatic experience with the police, and then goes and confronts people who are doing activism around a koala at the zoo. And like you see it happen in the show, where the character realizes that he's basically like experiencing oppression, and then like reacting negatively when he sees someone advocating for another being's oppression. And I think that's a really good case in point, where pretending that these are all separate siloed issues allows the systems of exploitation to keep us divided and drive wedges between groups that are experiencing forms of oppression rather than creating solidarity.
Yeah, but there has been a history of the animal rights movement kind of siloing ourselves. So we've got to do that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to bridge those gaps. Yeah. Well, yeah, it was such an important chapter. I'm so grateful for Soul's contribution, and I have a quote too from the chapter that I'd like to read. Maybe we'll wrap up with this quote. The humane hoax is a lie that allows our society to believe that unnecessary killing can be done in an ethical manner. We have been predisposed to violence towards non human animals so much that most of our culture assumes this violence is necessary for our survival. Many people not only don't question violence inflicted on non human animals, but they also don't question if non human animals deserve autonomy over their own bodies and the basic rights of personhood. The perpetrators of this oppression have been covered not only by years of normalized violence, but also trillions of dollars of marketing, social programming, and conditioning. Just a great, really, really well written and wonderful, important chapter to read. I'm grateful it's in there. Okay, so the last chapter that we want to talk about is Carol Adams' chapter. And I was so honored that Carol Adams contributed a chapter. Of course, Carol is a longtime vegan feminist writer and activist. She has contributed so much to the animal rights movement. I was just incredibly, incredibly honored that she agreed to include her chapter, and it's called One Bad Day. And it's this really short, powerful, almost like a poem piece. I think it's very poetic. She didn't like me calling it a poem. She she didn't want me to call it a poem, but I think it's poetic. And so many of us have heard this line, this one bad day, from small scale farmers, supposedly humane farmers, that our animals only have one bad day. And of course, Carol gets into all of the other bad days that every farmed animal endures, no matter the label, when they're castrated or debeaked or have their babies dragged from them after birth, or when their dear friend disappears forever, on and on. So, Sina, what did you think about Carol's chapter?
Yeah, it was a short chapter, but it had such an impact on me. And I think, like you said, Hope, that this is a phrase that we hear all the time from farmers, that the sheep had just one bad day. The cow had just one bad day. But we know that it isn't just one bad day. This is a day that the person is killed and experiences this violent death, and often like dragged to slaughter. But I think I appreciated how, like you said, almost in a poetic way, went through describing, wasn't it a bad day when she was forcibly made pregnant? Wasn't it a bad day when her calf was taken away from her? So, like, all of these moments that we would describe as bad, and even more so as horrific, but I just appreciated that she was able to describe that one phrase and really dive into it, in even in such a short chapter.
Yeah, it's a short chapter, but it packs a punch.
It sure does.
It's really powerful for sure. Yeah. Alistair?
Yeah, no, I agree with Sina and with you, Hope. I think it really packs a punch just in terms of how it kind of drives home the absurdity of that very idea of the one bad day. It's something that has made me furious for years when I hear farmers talking about that, or I hear people talking about that, because I think of like one bad day, yeah, it's like, stubbing your toe, or like, something kind of, minor happening. Whereas in this case, that just thinking about the one bad day is that, the day of slaughter, like that's it's more than just one bad day. It's a cataclysm. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
how little do you think that these animals value their lives that you want to talk about it in such a, trivial and,
Yeah.
condescending way? I really love the way that Carol kind of just blows that notion up by kind of, applying it to kind of different moments in every animal's lives where these terrible things are happening. So I think it's absurd to pretend that you could still use that term after really kind of seeing it in those ways that Carol lays it out.
Yeah, and it infuriates me because just calling it a bad day, animals want to live. They love their lives. They fight for their lives when they know they're threatened. A bad day, like she said, is like stubbing your toe or spilling coffee in the car. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a frightening and brutal end of your life. And that's way more than a bad day.
Yeah.
And she also implied that saying it's a bad day kind of implies that there's going to be more days ahead to look
Mm,
back on that day and say, wow, that was a bad day. Right.
Mhm.
It's not, it doesn't really imply that you're just going to end those days. And she said, actually, she was quoting another animal activist, Kim Stallwood, for this part. Why are the people who are oppressing other animals allowed to be the spokespeople and interpreters of other animals' experiences? This is something that also really angers me. And that's someone who is commodifying and exploiting these animals being able to say what their experience is. No, don't pretend that the emotional life and complexity of these animals. I mean, farmers, people that are exploiting these animals are looking at the situation from a very obscured lens, right? One that benefits upholding that worldview and that system of oppression. So they're going to, like you said, trivialize it or make it have a lot less substance and impact than the reality of it, which is that you are killing someone, you are taking someone's life forever. They will never have another day. It's so
Yeah.
frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and one thing that I've talked about before, and Hope, I think, like, your term, the ultimate betrayal, is such a good, summary of it, is that if even if you kind of go with the notion of like the one bad day concept, like, how horrifying must it be for that individual animal who, like, all of a sudden is being basically killed by someone who has up to now been like a source of food and stuff like that. Like, if we believe the stories of the humane farmers, for that one bad day to happen, I mean, that's like such a betrayal for the
Yeah.
animals.
Yeah.
I mean, I like, to me, like, when I think about that, it's just heartbreaking.
Hope,
Yeah.
that quote that you read that talked about what Kim Stallwood had talked about, I like the end of that quote also. Haven't we seen this reversal before when the abusers claim themselves as benefactors? First, they murder the victims, then they murder the language. So I think that's really brilliant. And after reading this chapter, I feel better prepared as an activist to be able to respond when I hear this one bad day argument. So that's one thing that I think is a good thing that will come out of that chapter.
Okay, so we really need to wrap up this wonderful session of the Humane Hoax Book Club. So I wanted to ask if you have any final thoughts on the book as a whole, or any of the other chapters you might just want to touch on, or anything else.
I'm excited to look back through some of the chapters, especially some of the ones that we talked today. I feel like I need to revisit them. This is going to be one of those pivotal books for me as an activist, like your Ultimate Betrayal book, where I will have it highlighted and go back through it multiple times. So I just appreciate your work on this and the work of all of the authors, including Alistair. So thank you.
Alistair?
Yeah, I would just say that I'm really excited for this to be coming out, because besides your other book, Hope, and Robert Grillo's book, there's so little material and resources available for people to use who want to kind of incorporate activism and advocacy against the humane hoax in their vegan activism. So I think it's an amazing collection of authors. I really enjoyed reading their chapters and kind of getting different insights from different angles. And I love the fact that it goes from people who are doing animal care to academics to activists. There's a great collection of people who contributed to this book. So I'm really excited for it to come out, and I think it'll be an important resource for people going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm excited too. Thank you, Sina and Alistair, both for being on the podcast. This has been a lot of fun. Our inaugural Humane Hoax Book Club meeting. And yeah, thanks so much, both of you, for being on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hope.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. I hope that you will be a supporter and an ambassador of this book. I feel that it's such an important resource to get out there. Please buy a copy or two. All the proceeds will be going to Compassionate Living. Please share about it. Share it on your social media, on your other networks. You can share this episode. That works. That helps. And come to the book release party on April 29th. I'll have a registration link in the show notes for that Saturday, April 29th, part of the larger Climate Healers Conference. But our book release party will be at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, just for an hour, April 29th. I'd love to see you there. If you know of a book club, maybe they would like to consider this book for their reading list, you could maybe suggest it. Maybe tell your local animal shelter about the book. If you have any ideas about how to promote this book and want to reach out to me, please do. So, for the next few episodes, we will be digging deeper into the book. For Earth Day, we will have, well, it's going to be a bit after Earth Day when it finally comes out. It's kind of Earth Day time right now. But for the next episode, we're going to have Nicholas Carter on. His chapter is in the greenwashing section of the book, and it's called The Failed Attempts to Greenwash Animal Farming. He is incredibly knowledgeable. We're going to do a thorough debunking of regenerative grazing and grass fed beef. So it's going to be really informative. So be sure not to miss that one, the next episode. I'll also have Lisa Barca on. Lisa actually contributed 2 chapters to the book, one on media and how the media and journalists portray the humane hoax and kind of prop up humane washing. And she co-wrote the chapter with Sailesh Rao called The Ethical Vegetarian Myth. So we'll be talking all about her chapters. So lots to come. I really hope that you enjoy the book. Let me know what you think about it. Let others know what you think about it. And I believe I said it in the beginning, but one of the best things that you can do to help promote this book is to write a review on Amazon. That's really, really helpful. Please be sure to write a review. It doesn't have to be long, on Amazon supporting the book. Thank you for being an ambassador of this new book. Read it, share it, and live vegan.